I'll never forget it. I was 29 years old. It was 2005, August 29th. I was standing inside the Hilton Hotel, soggy carpet, the windows had been blown out because the storm had already passed. But everybody said that the worst of the storm was over. Hurricane Katrina made its landfall and left, but it left with it a lot of pain. And when we stood inside of the Hilton Hotel, we heard on radios that people had the host say that the worst was behind us and that we had dodged the bullet. I was 29 years old covering that storm, and I thought, wow, this is great news. The worst of it is behind us. But as we started walking further east and further east in the city of New Orleans, where I was the morning anchor and a reporter, we started realizing that the water was getting higher and higher and higher. The worst of the storm had not yet been felt. The worst of the storm was in the aftermath. And that's what we found in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. We saw men and women with their children, their wives, their husbands, holding close to one another as they stood on rooftops. They used axes to get from their attic to the rooftop after more than 11 to 12, 13, 14 feet of water had flooded and ravaged their homes. And they waited for days for the Coast Guard helicopter to come pick them up. Hurricane Katrina was a terrible storm, but the aftermath was much worse. It is in the resilience of the people of the city of New Orleans that we realized that anything, the worst, can happen. And yet there is always, when there is a will, an ability to rebuild. The great city of New Orleans did just that. I stand proudly as a reporter and anchor who covered that storm and its aftermath with a picture over my shoulder that I keep in my office here at home of the city of New Orleans. It's actually a Christmas gift from my wife from years ago when we were dating. That's from the artist Mikolopoulos. He used to draw, and he still does, I believe, the French Quarter. Different streets. The streetscapes are vivid, they're bold, they're colorful, they're outlandish, and they're fun, like the city of New Orleans. You know, I think a little bit about the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina when I look at that picture, and I think, you know what? Even though that terrible storm whipped through that region almost 16 years ago, that bold, colorful streetscape still stands, and the heart of that city still very much beats wildly to say that the best party in the world is happening here. And then I think about this country and a different storm, COVID-19, that made its way into the United States almost a year ago. We heard about the storm much like you would a hurricane forecast. It was coming on shore. We didn't know what to expect. After all, every storm is different. The personality of every storm feels different for different people. Boy, wasn't that the case for us? The storm affected everybody differently. If you have elderly people in your family, it hit you especially hard. If you have people in your family that are afflicted with health conditions that had before kind of laid dormant and that you knew were there, the disparities, the problems, but you didn't realize how severe it was until this storm came ashore. We all together as a country dealt with that and continue to deal with it. The aftermath, as we know, isn't quite over. The storm may have landed. The eye of it over the United States, the worst of it, we hope, we saw last year when hospital beds were overflowing with patients who needed a breath of fresh air. We know now that these cases continue to go up. We now know that the cases are not as severe in many cases. We also know that the treatments are better. We know that there's a vaccine out there. But still, the worst of the storm, although it has passed, the aftermath is still very much with us. 1 year later, that's a long storm. When I covered Hurricane Katrina when I was 29 years old, I thought to myself, I don't think I'll ever see this kind of human suffering again. The number of people who had died in that storm, well over 1,000, many of whom we saw on the streets. Violence after the storm. Pawn shops being lit on fire, people being shot on the streets, martial law. I thought for sure that would be the last time that I would see anything that bad. Little did I know that COVID-19, this terrible storm that's a Category 5 that came rushing ashore last March on the United States shorelines, would bring with it other mini tornadoes that would erupt, not then, but wait a minute, as soon as you can catch your breath months later. The civil unrest, a political election, pitting not only the country against one another, but families, moms, dads, brothers, sisters against one another. We didn't know that those tornadoes that spawned off of this terrible storm would make the pandemic feel even worse, even longer. We now know that the election has passed. Perhaps people are getting back together after getting their vaccines. Perhaps they're able to, as the CDC suggests, able to take their masks off with 2 vaccinated families who've received both their shots, sitting together at the dinner table, realizing that there's better things to talk about than whether or not one man is better than the other to lead the country. 2 men that you would never even know, never even meet, only the ones that cable news pundits would tell you about. Sound bites carefully engineered to make you feel and believe one thing over another on talk shows and commentary shows. We know that those who paid close attention to the headlines knew the truth deep down in their heart, but stood with their candidate, their man, for as long as they could. Again, fighting husband and wife, father and son, sister and brother. That was not a fun tornado. A more serious tornado that spawned from this terrible pandemic, this terrible storm, was of course the civil unrest that, like so many storms, it unpacked and unearthed some stuff that had already been kind of dwelling right beneath us all this time. The disparities, some of the problems that people have been saying, look, please look at the pain we're dealing with, look at the things we're going through. And all of it came to a head in the middle of a global pandemic. You know, if you really think about what a storm is like, when people evacuate from a storm and they settle into a hotel, perhaps not knowing if their house is going to be okay, the storm's still passing over their beloved city, they get a chance in a hotel to come together and say, thank goodness we made it out alive, but we don't know what we're going back to. This storm, much like a hurricane, is very much like that. What are we going to go back to? What will we go home to? What will our homes look like? What will our relationships look like with one another? Those are all questions that have yet to be answered, but we're beginning to answer those questions. The hope after any terrible storm is that perhaps we've learned something. Perhaps we've been able to protect ourselves, yes, from a future storm, but also learn about what adversity means to us and our communities. We know that in the city of Detroit, like in so many other large cities, they got hit the hardest at first, but they also showed with their resilience and their unity, looking out for aunts and uncles, looking out for brothers and sisters, many of whom lived in the same house together, that they could mask up and fight this virus. We then learned, of course, that that would be the case across the board, regardless of the color of your skin. But those other scars, those other tornadoes that came ashore, what about them? What will we come back to? What will we go back to? How will we choose to live our lives differently? Not just about Zoom or not Zoom, going into the office, driving again, going to work, not about eating at restaurants or getting takeout at home, but about the more serious and more important stuff, how we choose to treat each other, what we take for granted, what we truly love and why we love it, and never forgetting that each and every day, not just on holidays, on Mother's Day and Father's Day, and on Christmas, and on any chosen holiday that you gather your thoughts and reflect. But on a random Monday, what do we choose to learn from this terrible storm that came ashore? COVID-19 was that Category 5 storm that came ashore, and it brought with it many tornadoes that spawned all kinds of hate, all kinds of terror, all kinds of pain. But in the end, as we put the bandages on and we sit back in that hotel room like evacuees do after a storm, when we take a breath in that lobby and look at a neighbor who looks different than us, do we look at each other and ask the question, wow, what have we learned from this? Or do we just notice the differences once again? You hope and you pray that people who've come together, evacuated from this terrible storm, can look at one another and not see party lines, red or blue, not see the men or women that they voted for, but rather see another person, another family member, another son, another father, another brother, another mother, another sister, another daughter, who literally can say, we all went through this storm together. We were all hit differently because we all came from different neighborhoods. But boy, we all know the flavor of this storm left a bitter, bitter, awful taste in our mouths. How do we sweeten? How do we get back past this and sweeten the future together? It's, I think, by really sitting down, looking at one another in the eye and talking about what we have in common as a country and not what tears us apart. I think we can all do that together now that this storm has given us enough time, enough reprieve to perhaps catch our breath, albeit evacuated from our lives as we knew it. As we look back at each other, I hope that today, even on a Zoom call, we wish we could all be together in a room reflecting on what brings us together and what makes us so much the same. I hope that we will never forget those lessons. I know the city of New Orleans didn't. They love to party. They love a good life. They love a good drink and a good laugh. They haven't forgotten that terrible day, August 29th of 2005, that almost took everything away from them. And so when they get back together for Mardi Gras next year, it was canceled this past year, perhaps they'll remember all of the lessons that we're talking about here today. I know I will, and I hope you will too. Have a great day. Reverend, thank you for having me. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I look forward to being back with this whole group one day again soon. Let's do it in person. I've never looked forward to a boiled chicken dinner and green beans at a speaking engagement hall as much as I have now. I miss community. I miss people. I miss handshakes. I miss smiles. Look forward to getting those back again without a screen dividing us. Take care, be well, and we'll see you on Fox 2 News at 5 o'clock. Bye-bye.